My name is Rachel Kincaid, and I am the president of Moses. And I'd like to offer a warm welcome to all of you to our Lunch and Learn trauma before incarceration with our honored guest, Myra McNair, owner and founder of Anesis Therapy. Moses is a nonprofit interfaith organization whose mission is to build collective power and to dismantle the systems of mass incarceration and mass supervision and to eradicate the racial disparities in our community which contribute to them. If you'd like to know more about Moses, visit www.mosesmadison.org. Today we had plans of having Art Chigoni come and open us with prayer today, but he will not be with us physically because he is helping out a dear friend, Bill Miller. Art Chigoni's Indian name, Kanasa, means little golden eagle. He's a traditional dancer and co-founder for Call for Peace Drum and Dance Company from 1990 to 2021. Promoting peace and justice in the US and around the world, Call for Peace, Dancing the Dream, honoring the tapestry of humanity. My husband, James Morgan, and I are good friends of Art. So this morning, James is going to read the prayer he wrote for us. James?
You're on mute, James.
Carmela, and mute always gets me. But thank you. And I would like to first say that it is an honor for me to be able to share my brother Art's prayer with you this morning. So I want to briefly ask that you find a place of comfort. Take a moment to deep breathe and relax. And I will share with you my brother's words of wisdom for peace for all of us in this space this morning. Great Spirit, teach us how to trust and heal our hearts, our minds, our inner knowing, the senses of our body, the blessings of our spirit. Great Spirit, teach us to trust these things so we may enter a renewed sacred space within and love beyond our fears. Great Spirit, that we may walk in balance and beauty together with the passing of each glorious sunshine. And again, extended peace and blessings from my brother Art. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I am now honored to introduce the program coordinator of Just Dane's Just Bakery program, Carmela Glenn. Carmela will be having a dynamic conversation with Myra today. I truly hope you enjoy yourself and learn a lot. Carmela?
Hello, thank you for having me. I am always honored to participate in anything Moses does, and I am extra excited to have this conversation with Myra. This is one of my favorite subjects to have, and to be able to have such an expert at the table, I'm really excited. I just want to remind everybody that's in the room that this Lunch and Learn is normally a fundraiser for Moses. So anybody that can do any kind of donation, it is always important for the work that Moses does and is allowed to keep doing. So I want to remind everybody of that. And then I would like to introduce Myra and have a conversation about trauma. Myra, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Myra McNair. I am the founder of Anesis Therapy here in Madison, Wisconsin. I've been doing therapeutic work for families, children for quite some time now. And I'm very excited to talk to everyone a little bit more about trauma today.
Thank you. So in starting this conversation with you, one of the things I really love, and I know we're going to talk a lot about a lot of different subjects I'm going to have, and you and I spoke in um, depth about this this lunch and learn. But I really think it's important for people to understand kind of why you got into this work and how Anesis does things differently, because I think that'll explain why we asked you about adult and childhood trauma, and it'll explain a lot of the questions I asked later. So could you tell us a little
Yeah.
bit about the work and the work of Anesis especially?
Yeah, so I founded Anesis Therapy. We're right here in Madison, Wisconsin, and we really serve all of our clients are from the Dane County area. So I worked at another mental health agency before I started Anesis. And I really wanted to, one, expand my own practice and how I serve Black and Brown people. I had no idea no, Anesis was going to grow to the point that we did grow. And we grew because there is a need for that, for people to really understand racial trauma, to understand the needs of Black and Brown people when they're coming in with mental health needs. And so if I kind of fast forward to where we are today, I founded it in 2016. This is our 5-year anniversary. And we are at, I think, around 43 staff members, and we serve, I think, anywhere from 700 to 1,000 active clients right now. So the need is there. I think we always knew that, but I think there was also this stigma and this like theme or like myth that like Black people, and Brown people, don't do therapy, right? That people are not going to go in for therapy services because there's so much stigma. And I think having the providers that one understand, like the racial trauma, having that cultural competent care, but also looking like the community and from the community that we serve, I think that gave people a lot of permission of like, oh, this is normal. We can go in for mental health services. I'm not going to be judged. Like, people understand my community. I don't have to go into therapy and spend, the first 30 minutes educating my provider about me and my family. So I think that those are some of the things on like what grew us, and yeah, and a little bit about like what we do and how we kind of see patient care.
I think that leads kind of really great into my next question, which is why you do it so good at why you guys are so good at what you do. And I think it's the plethora of the array of services, which is, so if we talk about like certified peer specialist work, right? And then we talk about clinical work and those living together, which we know that they should, that multidisciplinary kind of work. So why was that important, that all pieces of a person is going to be represented in therapy?
Yeah. So, we have a lot of different clients. Like we have, clients that, they're just here for like maybe once a month. They just want a like we call it mental health checkup, right? And then we have like a lot of our clients that are like, there's a lot of different layers. There's just a lot of moving parts and a lot of things going on. And there might be AODA, substance abuse issues. There might be some family things. There might be housing issues on top of the mental health issue, right? And coming in to a therapy session 1 hour a week is not going to cut it for a lot of clients, right? You need a team. You need a whole recovery team to kind of surround you and collaborate together because they're showing up for you. And so that's why we have peers, because they walk alongside the client in a different way that our clinicians do. That's why we have substance abuse counselors. That's why we have case managers. Because everyone is going to have different parts. We have some families that are coming in and every single family is seeing someone different. And then they come in for family services. So we have an in-home family program that they go in the home and provide mental health services. And then we also have someone that might be doing individual work with mom or with the kids. And everyone collaborates together. And for some families, that's what it takes, to kind of get back to where they want to be and for their own recovery or treatment goals.
So in saying that, this multidisciplinary, really meeting people where they're at, understanding that there's layers to this, that's kind of what trauma is too, right? So can you
Absolutely.
explain what is trauma?
Yeah, so I'll give kind of like a generic or like a DSM definition of like what trauma is.
Mhm.
And then I'll talk about a little bit about how that's really changed over time. So
That's
when we look
exactly what
at,
I was going to ask you to do.
yeah, so it's really changed. So when we talked when in psychology, when people used to talk about trauma, it used to be like very much focused on like veterans or people who had experienced war or like, some type of violent crime or something like that. And what we understand about trauma is it is really a lot more than that, right? It could be a dog bite. It could be experiencing sexual abuse or some type of sexual trauma. It is a lot of different things. It could be a car accident. And so what we've a general kind of definition would be is like something that really scared you, something that you witnessed even, or something that you even experienced like right on, right? So it could be, like I said, witnessed, experienced, but something that was really scary, something that just kind of like, horrified you. And then what we even know now more is that it also includes racial discrimination and racial trauma. So that's the definition of trauma. And there are a lot of different types of trauma. So what you're going to see in the DSM is like that whole definition of like what post-traumatic stress disorder is. But what we know is that what I tell people all the time when I talk about trauma is I look at the whole book of the DSM, except for maybe a couple of the diagnoses in there. I look at those as all different manifestations of trauma. So just because you've experienced trauma, it doesn't mean you're going to have PTSD. For some people, it looks like depression, right? For some people, it's anxiety. They may not meet the whole criteria of PTSD. Some people experience a trauma and they're fine. So I always use the example of a car accident. It could be 4 people in a car accident. They've all experienced that same car accident, but everyone is going to leave that car accident with a different narrative and a different experience. So one person out of that car accident may say, you know what? I cannot get in cars anymore. Every time I hear the screeches of like brakes or, loud cars outside, I startle, I jump. The thought of getting in the car just increases my anxiety, right? And for other people, they're like, wow, that was scary, but I'm going to get right back in a car again, right? And
Yes.
so that's how trauma is. I can't define that for someone. Everyone could experience that same thing, but walk away with a different experience for themselves.
Yes, when you shared that with me when we were talking, I actually had a note for myself, like bring that back up because I think that that is such a great analogy of understanding really that the person will tell you, right? That's that
Mhm.
person-centered work of they're going to tell you what their trauma is, and it's our job to listen.
Absolutely.
So what are the different types of trauma that you see in the Dane County area, especially?
Yeah, so we see at our clinic, like all different types of trauma. I will say, we use that word trauma and it is such a huge word.
Hmm.
And so we kind of like to break it down, right? As, people in the field. And so we talk about developmental childhood trauma. And that is trauma that happens, usually under the age of 6, like when those real kind of those milestone kind of development times happen within kids, and there's a trauma that happens. And a lot of trauma happens to people before they even have verbal skills, right? So we're talking about age 1, we're talking about 6 months, 2 years old. And people ask, can you do trauma work with those kids? Yes, we can. And that's a whole nother talk that I won't get into. But yes, that happens. So that's developmental trauma. And what I would like to say about developmental trauma is kids may not have, or little ones may not have the words yet because they don't have the verbal skills. But what happens is they store the trauma in a lot of other ways. So trauma is never forgotten. Okay. We store it in our bodies. We store it in our hormones. We store it in the way we react to others, the way we relate to others, in our meaning making on how we define who we are. Right. And you say, how in the world can a baby or a toddler do that? And I tell people it's the same thing. Have you guys ever seen like a toddler drop a bottle? And then a caregiver or someone goes, oh, there's your bottle. And they pick it up. And then the toddler kind of laughs like, that was fun. I'm going to do that again. Right. They have made some meaning around when I do this, this happens. Right. They even have thought it's either funny or, humorous or entertaining to watch maybe a caregiver do that. So if there's a trauma that happens, and unfortunately, usually it's around between a caregiver, it's mostly 60% when that happens to kids that don't have verbal skills. It's usually a caregiver. They're making meaning around that relationship, around how they react and how they show up in the world. So it is very complex, but yes, trauma happens to little ones. And unfortunately, yes, they do remember it, but in different ways. And then there's complex trauma. And I always explain that of kind of being like an onion where, someone comes in my office and they're here for one thing. And then I do an assessment and it's like, oh, it's not just that one thing that one trauma that happened. It's maybe neglect growing up. It's you didn't have enough food, right? There was neighborhood violence. There was racial discrimination on top of that. And so that's where we look at that's complex trauma, because I can't ask you which trauma was more harmful, because it's just everything was trauma. Or people don't even realize it was trauma because it was so normalized. Like, wow, that was trauma. That was my everyday life in my home. What do you mean? Right? So that's complex trauma. And then there's intergenerational trauma. And that's when there's the trauma that's just kind of passed down within the family, so many times I work with families like, yeah, I was sexually abused. My mom was sexually abused. My grandma was sexually abused. And sometimes it even happens within the family where it's an uncle or a grandparent, and it goes on and on and on, right? And so there's those family patterns of trauma, right? And it's so common. And they're doing a lot of research even around intergenerational trauma, and there not being an experience of trauma, but it being passed down in your genes. And what that looks like is how we respond, and having kind of like those PTSD or those certain genetic markers where we're responding, or we have those cortisol hormonal levels, but we never experienced trauma. But our family member did, our mother did, our father did, and those things were carried down in our genetics. So there's a lot of research going on with that as well right now.
And then there's it's the intergenerational kind of like historical.
Yeah, there's historical trauma. And so that's very similar. And so that's where we see it with things like that have happened, like slavery or the Holocaust, or we're talking about, like genocide. There's been a lot of research with that intergenerational trauma and the genetic items that I talked about earlier with Rwanda right now. With that whole next generation after, of kids that survived or where moms were pregnant during the genocide in Rwanda. So there's that whole historical trauma, and then, a racial and discrimination type of trauma as well. That's really tied into that historical trauma.
They all sound very complex, right?
Yes.
It is just a complex conversation, and which I think I think I'll revisit this and remind people that it's why you have to listen to the person talking to you, right? Because it is their story and their trauma to tell you what it is.
Yes.
So in talking about children and trauma, can you talk a little bit about the ACEs and how sometimes it's identified for adults who have dealt with trauma when they were young?
Yeah, so there's like that whole ACE study, and so that's adverse childhood experiences. And so it's like a pretty simple assessment. It's like, I think about, yeah, it's about
10
10
question.
questions. Yeah.
Mhm.
And so anyone can take it. You can Google it after this and like take it for yourself. And so what they have found is like, medical doctors had did this research, and what they found is that they felt there was a correlation, and what they found out there was
Mhm.
with their clients, with their patients that were coming in that had things like heart disease, diabetes, like all of the physical health problems. And they're like, is there a correlation between having these physical health conditions with childhood trauma? And so what they found out that there was, right? And so it's just a really interesting study. And so it's a thing it's a really easy questionnaire that I think a lot of different agencies use. You don't have to be like licensed to use
Right.
the questionnaire. You can do it to yourself. But it's just a nice like thing to kind of see like how much trauma have you experienced before the age 18? And, I know for me, when I was growing up, trauma wasn't even really a word used, And so now I get so much joy knowing that people are really normalizing this and asking these things at like the doctor's office or at preschools and, just places, to get people thinking about trauma, right? For families. And then also for people who are working with the families, and I think trauma informed care is important, even if no one gets this questionnaire, but I think it's a great
Yes.
tool to use.
Well, what I found when we use it for Just Bakery, and then when Anesis comes for the trauma group to do for our students. And so what I find so interesting about it is that the health outcomes for even a 1 or a 2 on there, that can be asthma or ADHD and all of these things for a 1 or a 2. And um, someone like me who's a 10, or other students that are a 10, it's like, okay, so at first, right, it's this shocking thing for those who have never taken it. And so you go digging in. So one of the things I found out, and which was really exciting for me, was because trauma showing up so differently for everybody, what helped me understand it was the resiliency part, right?
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about why people understanding their resiliency factors too is so important?
Yeah. I think it's so important. One, and I'm so glad, Carmela, that you repeated what I said earlier about it's important for someone to tell you when something feels like trauma to them,
Hmm.
because we can look at that and be like, oh my goodness, like you should be in treatment, you should get help. This happened to you, right? And
Yes.
so I use this because I'll use this example around sexual abuse, right? With children and then telling their caregivers. So one of the biggest indicators of someone who has been sexually abused, right, whether it's molestation, rape, or whatever, is if, especially when they're under the age of 18, the biggest indicator of healing is having a supportive caregiver that
Hmm.
believes them, period. Why I can't say and name someone's trauma, I cannot tell you how many times I've had a youth in here and it's not the sexual assault that was the trauma. It was that they didn't have a caregiver that believed them. It was going back to that caregiver to tell them what happened, and the response wasn't what they needed.
That makes
So when
so much sense.
right, so when we're talking about resilience,
Yes.
right, we're talking about having a supportive caregiver, and remind you, I'm not saying mom and dad, a caregiver. It can be grandma, it can be auntie, it can be whoever that is, right?
Hmm.
Having someone who is there for you. And what I really call that too, and what we say in infant mental health, is an angel in the nursery. So we can all look back maybe in our lives and say, maybe something bad happened, maybe something traumatic happened. That could be our ghost in the nursery, right? But we all also had, usually, most people have had an angel in the nursery. It could have been the next door neighbor. It could have been that teacher, right? Like that somebody who was just there for you, that did something that was just so meaningful. And so that's why it's so important when we talk about resilience, right? So we have those different resilient factors. And so that's why we can't name that trauma. for someone. And that's why we can't get all scared, right? When someone has had a traumatic experience, because there might be a lot of resilience factors for them.
So when you're that the how do I state this? So when we're talking about trauma on one hand, and children are youth or then adult that are talking about their youth, that resiliency of that caretaker, could that be mentors? Could that
Yes.
be, it just needs to be that somebody believe them and trust them?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And then you can have more, right? So for some people, maybe they only have one resilient thing, factor. And so there's actually like a resilience questionnaire, just like there is the ACE questionnaire. And so
Mhm.
some of the things they ask you is like, we've had rules in our house and we're expected to keep them. When I felt bad, I could almost always find someone I trusted to talk to.
Mhm.
Someone in my family cared about how I was doing in school. Like, just those are some. So you might have not had all of them, but maybe there was some, or maybe you had all of them. So maybe your ACEs are super full, right?
Mhm.
But you had half the resilience. So it's going to be different for everyone. But
Mhm.
that's, again, going to the car accident, everyone walks away different with that different experience.
Absolutely. So, I'm going to change things around. I was going to go into another subject, but I want to kind of dig into, because we're on about mentor and that. So, as someone I know you do some work with MMSD, correct?
Mhm.
And what is that work? Can you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, so we do the CBITS group. And so that's it's like a cognitive behavioral trauma therapy. And so we do that in the office as well, but it looks very different in the office than at schools. So in the schools, we use one clinician and then we use the school social worker. And the reason why we use the school social worker with us is because when we're gone, when Anissa's leaves out,
Mm,
there's got to be someone at the school constantly there for that kiddo that they recognize and know, like, there's somebody there that I can trust and talk to. So CBITS is ran for middle schools. And there is a different type of program that's ran for elementary, and they're talking about doing something similar for high school. But for right now, the program is only for middle school age kids.
okay.
And so we do it with that social worker, and it is in a group format. So usually when we do our trauma work in the office, it's very much dyadic around, the parent or around the child who is our patient, but then the parent. And so we
Mm,
do a lot of that dyadic work with some type of caregiver. But in the schools, we do it with all the kids and we do it in a group format. And
mm,
then at the end, towards the end, they share a trauma narrative, believe it or not, with their peers.
nice.
And it can look very different. It can be, there's kind of like a storyline. And I won't get too much into it, but they can use art. So some kids choose just to only color it and with their art. But the big thing about our trauma narratives, what I will share, won't go too much in detail about that, is that the kids make meaning. So whether it's in the office, whether it's at the schools, they make meaning about their trauma. So we really do that work where we're making meaning and making sure that kids do not blame themselves for the trauma. So that's the whole work, because usually with kids and trauma, we do this thing called a responsibility pie. And they should not be on that responsibility pie. It should have nothing to do with them being in the wrong place or the wrong time. Like, nope, it's not your fault what happened.
Mm,
You
so
should have had
important.
someone there to protect you, right? And so it's really making sure that kids understand that they don't own that responsibility of what happened to them. And we also do like that safety planning of how can we be safe? How can we help you be safe? Who's your supports, right? And again, that's why we have that school social worker there. So we know when we're leaving, we've known that we've established there's that school social worker there for safety.
That sounds so wonderful.
Mhm.
Um, Yes, that sounds so wonderful. My son's school got a small grant to do some restorative justice circles, and they were all trained in that, to be able to sit around and, to talk to each other and be that. And that sounds like a lot like that idea of letting the children be centered with their voice.
Yeah.
Is there a good buy-in for that? Are parents jumping in? Is there some education that needs to go behind that?
I think there is some, I do think there needs to be some education because I also have kids in MMSD and I don't think I hear about any of it like
Mhm.
on this end of me being
Right.
a parent. But we do get kids. I mean,
Yeah.
we get kids. So I don't know. It would be a good question to ask MMSD, how many kids are they actually inviting in compared to how many kids actually opt into the groups?
Mhm.
What they're finding now is that there needs to be a more focus on the racial trauma.
Mm.
And so
Yes.
we are doing some talks around that with Journey Mental Health Center and talking around what will that look like if school social workers are not, Black and brown, how do we incorporate racial trauma groups? So
That
to
would
be
be awesome.
continued
To be
in discussion
continued.
now. Mhm.
Well, that kind of covers my next one. As you know, Moses has the Racist Justice for All Committee, which is really trying to dedicate themselves to getting into the schools and kind of trying to interrupt that prison to pipeline, school to prison pipeline that we see happening so much for Black and brown children. So you kind of covered a few of them, but what are some resources or policy or programs that you think the schools could use, Civets being one of them, and for the people in the room to be able to engage and interrupt this school to prison pipeline?
Yeah. I think mental health is huge, right? I think there's so much. It's such a loaded question.
I know.
Well, and this is probably still not going to solve it all. I think one is a lot of the teachers are not from the communities that they teach in. And I think there's a disconnect there, right? And I think there's a disconnect. I used to work in MMSD. I think there's also a disconnect with like school and family relationships in general, like just in general. There's and I think that's like a lot of system issues.
Mhm.
I think yes, it's the school. I think also why is that? We need to take a step back. Why can't parents be involved? Is it because they're busy? Is it because there's like other things going on, right? So there's some systems issues, right, that I think lacks parent engagement or the reason why parents can't be as engaged. So I think those are some big things that are just like outside of mental health that just kind of need to be looked at. And then I really think there does need to be like a huge mental health, like look into like, just being aware and trauma informed. Um, I will say one thing that we do is we do criminalize mental health in general. And so,
That's what I was gonna
yeah,
say.
so if we know that, when does it start?
Right.
Does it start in elementary? Is it starting in preschool? Right. But we also know that there's also the racial discrimination. So it's
Mhm.
layered, right? So, because not everyone who's Black and brown that ends up in prison and that necessarily has mental health stuff, right?
Correct.
So there are biases, and we see it in a lot of different ways in schools. We see it with kids being expelled. We know that that happens in preschool. It starts happening in preschool where we start seeing those rates that are
Mhm.
not right, that don't match the population, right? So there's more Black boys that are getting expelled out of preschool than white kids, and they're not the majority. So we see it starting to happen there, right?
Mhm.
Um, but it's so layered,
I
Carmel. It's such
know,
a layered
it's so late.
question.
I know. So let
So
me ask you
I
this. Let
think
me
it's
ask you this really quick, because I think this will focus it a tiny bit. So because you brought this up, and right, because there's this punitive feeling around mental health and trauma, which sometimes might not be mental health in the sense of like clinical, but maybe trauma addressed and talked about, and the fear from sometimes of the system, because that engagement, right, from families of color, sometimes there's a fear of letting you in and you not understanding what my family's going through, right? So some education in the system around.
Well, and that goes with that relationship. And if you're not from the community, right? So if you're like, so I'll just share like one, like this is a personal story. So like me stepping
Mhm,
back and not being a professional. So this
mhm,
is when I worked in the schools. And so I'll spare the names of anyone, but I was working in one school here in MMSD. I was at that time a parent liaison. And so my child, I think my son was I think he was in kindergarten at the same time, but at a different school. And my job was to get the teachers together, the kindergarten teachers together, to do an informational meeting for parents. Okay. So I'm going around to the different teachers to gather, what do you want to talk about with the parents? What are you willing to do for this meeting? All right. So this is like an engagement thing. We're trying to engage parents. The teacher begins to tell me that she has no leaders in her classroom anymore because all of the white kids are now going to the DLI, like the dual language immersion program. And she teaches English. And she tells me this, me to my face. And so, those beliefs, I think it has to
yeah,
start with teachers, right? And there has to be, and I would say, yes, there has to be training, but I think maybe in the interviewing process or something, there needs to be more because
yeah.
she didn't, to me, she wasn't from our community.
Mhm,
Um, and she did not believe in her students, in the families. And it
mhm.
really, really, really broke my heart because I had a kindergartner at that time. And I thought, wow, if my son was in her class right away, she would not have looked at him as a leader.
Mhm. Right.
The other thing was the majority of, at that particular school I worked at, most of the Black boys were on medication for ADHD.
Mm,
And
mhm.
as a mental health professional, no, I don't think those kids all had ADHD. So there are some serious issues that are happening, and it's starting really, really young. So I would say it needs to start at that preschool and that elementary
Yeah.
levels where the change needs to happen. Because if someone's looking at a kid or a student as not a leader in kindergarten, now we're talking about trauma. This all ties in.
This all ties in.
It all
Yes.
ties in. For the student, right? How are they making meaning of how they're getting treated?
Right.
And what is the trauma when you've been maybe cared for, loved on, poured into from ages 0 to 5, and then you go into a setting like that?
Yeah.
But you don't really have the words or the communication to share exactly what's going on or really understand what kind of discrimination you're facing at age 5. So they've done research around race, right?
Mhm.
And kids know and understand race by the age of 4 years old, white and black. It doesn't matter what race you are. You understand race, you know what it is, and you know your place in society at age 4.
Wow.
At age 4.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about racial trauma, we're talking about developmental trauma, complex trauma, right?
Mhm.
Starts very young.
And if the system isn't ready and or understand it, where
Mhm.
does it go for that child? Where do
Right,
they express it? Or is it also compounding the harm?
right. How do you make meaning of it? I'm flawed, I'm bad, right? These are kids. This
Yeah.
is this is how you make meaning if everyone's not looking at you a certain kind of way, right?
Mhm.
In schools or other settings, when you leave the home, you turn the TV on, you see a certain image. How do you make meaning of that? What's the narrative that you tell yourself, that you believe about yourself?
Right.
I'm not going to be anyone. I'm not going to grow up to be anything, right? I don't see myself in the world in those type of roles. So, racial trauma is not always like something that's in someone's face that is a certain thing. It's like, it's all of it
All
compounded,
of it.
all of it.
Systemic.
Yeah,
All out there. It's out there, and how do you name it? And it almost feels crazy making, right?
right.
Yes. So, so as someone who, going through young school, as I think about that, right? Like, I wasn't sharing, and yet I wasn't engaging in school. I was someone who would have been diagnosed in those days, even as I date myself, with ADHD. And it was really, there was stuff going on at home, but I needed to sit in this chair boringly and have you talk to me, and you wonder why my body is moving and I can't concentrate, right? And I'm not going to share with you because you're going to punish me. And in a child's mind, I'm thinking I'd rather live in a box under a bridge with my parents than be taken from them, even in the worst of situations.
Mhm.
So, how are families being taken care of? You talked about SIBITs. Is there something else that families can be um, receiving care? I know Anesis does all of those things. What other systems could be assisting in that? MMSD, right? And with your SIBITs, can you talk about why it is important for the whole family to be
Yeah,
receiving
it
it?
is. Yeah. And so that's where, to me, that's where it's lacking
Hmm.
when we do the work in the schools, right? Because there isn't that dyadic care with the parent or the caregiver, right? And so what I really love, my favorite trauma therapy is doing it with the 0 to 6 years old, those families. And I'll tell you a lot of reasons why. One, because the earlier the better. The earlier the better. Two, there's so much intensive work we do with parents when they have a child that has experienced trauma from 0 to 6. Okay.
Hmm.
And three, we work on the caregiver and child relationship. It's the biggest part or biggest component of that therapy. We're working on that therapy. So we're doing play therapy, and the parent is right there sitting on the floor with us, right?
Hmm.
And we're having the kid they're reenacting some of their trauma sometimes through that play. And then we're talking with the parent, right? And there's not a lot of, when it comes to that, like trauma work, there's not a lot of things or other programs, I would say, other than like probably like mental health. But I would say there are like, you know, the birth to 3, like the in-home visitors. And I think there's a lot of that
Yes.
care being poured in to the families that have smaller kids. And I'm glad there is a reason for it, but there needs to be more for kids who are older as well, right?
Right.
Because a lot of people get missed through the cracks. But yeah, I do think the schools there, that's one thing, is there needs to be that more parent or family engagement. And I
Hmm.
tell people all the time, when you go into working with youth, and I absolutely hate it. It feels like that, like chalkboard sound, the nails on a chalkboard sound when I hear people say this. But when I hear people say, I love young people, I love working with them, but I hate working with their parents. I say, oh, no, then you don't like family work. You don't like youth work. Because if
Yeah.
we don't understand parents and
Hmm.
we don't understand what they're going through and understand their trauma narrative, you are not going to help that young person, because
Absolutely.
you can only be there once or twice a week. They're there with their caregiver. And we want to see strong families. We don't want to just see strong young people. We want to see strong families. There's no such thing as a strong young person if their family's not strong. And so
Absolutely.
that means, yes, their mental health care, but it also means other things: housing, job, employment, finances, good access to good food, right? All those different things.
Well, my son had a bully in kindergarten, right? And and trying to work through this, and I am going somewhere with this, but so I remember asking for a parent meeting, and no one showed up the first time, right? And then the second time we go, an old a way older woman, probably in her 60s, shows up, and I see her with her walker coming down the hallway, and bells went off, right? Bells are going off in my head. And um and what ended up coming out of the meeting is because he has an IEP and they're talking all this stuff, is I asked if I could join his IEP committee
Oh,
because I wanted to be able to be there for this family. And my son and him are actually really good friends now because I was able to teach my son, right, that listen, he's not trying to hurt you, he's hurting.
yes.
And so I joined his board, and I think that that's, that would be another area that she would, I know you have to be asked, but, and he's now doesn't have one. We were able to close it a couple of years ago, his whole IEP, because people stood up and were able to just say, yes, stop, listen to him, he's going through. So um, what, what do you see some of the other underlying factors kind of going on in Dane County around childhood trauma?
Well,
And
what we know.
maybe let's lead that into,
Mhm.
because I really want you to dig into what you shared with me about trauma period last year, COVID. Your session you did on PBS, the I Can't Breathe. And if you would share with the group on Dane County period youth. So I'm gonna give you a few minutes here to go on, but then talk about what we all had to do as Black people last year when we couldn't breathe.
Yeah. So I would say if you go on the ACEs website, they talk about like, I think it's like 60 or 65% of youth, just nationwide, United States, have experienced childhood trauma. I think we have not even touched the surface of it. I think in Dane County right now, if you look at CPS referrals, only Black and brown kids are getting referred.
Yeah.
One, that's a biases, right? It's a bias about Black and brown families and maybe how like we're raising families or how we're relating to our kids or different things like that. The majority of those referrals do come from MMSD, from teachers. Two, it also makes me very sad for other children. Because to say that with white and Asian kids, that there's no trauma going on in their house, that's funny. It's not funny, but that's like, it's really sad. It's funny
Yes.
to think that that's not a thing, right? We know that's so not true. So when I say we haven't touched the surface of it, we're not touching the surface because people are so busy being biased. I feel that there are a lot of kids that are not getting the help and the support and the treatment that they need, right? And a lot of families that are not getting
Yes.
the help and the support that they need. So that makes me sad. So that's what I think is a trend happening here in Dane County. I will say, as far as last year and with COVID, I think we, for one, I will say here at our clinic, we have exploded for referrals. We have a 200 wait list right now, which really saddens me. We have people that are not leaving, right? So you get people usually who, I would say, like I have a client that I've seen for 8 years. That's really normal. But my whole caseload is not people that have seen me for 8 years, right? You have people that come in, they see you maybe for 6 to 9 months. Some people only see you sometimes for 5 sessions and they're like, that's all I needed and I'm fine. What we're finding is people are not leaving, right? We're having clients that have come in and start seeing us since COVID, and they have been with us since, and they've been with us for a year. And that's really hard when you have a wait list, but it's also really hard when there's been one thing after another. And that's what COVID has been. So I think for Black and brown people, yes, we've had COVID. We saw those numbers were disproportionate towards Black people, right? Black people were getting really hit hard in Milwaukee and in all areas. And we're dying at higher rates as well from COVID. So we experienced that. We experienced, George Floyd being murdered. And that was not the first time, right? We have seen police brutality that wasn't new to us, right? But the impact with COVID made it very different. And I think that's where
Mm.
people always say, what made that so different? We had it on social media. It wasn't that it was just on a camera. We've seen it. We've seen Tamir Rice. We've seen a lot of different videos that we didn't want to see, right? And so I think there's a combination of it, right? It was the stress of COVID. It was, I think also, like, are you serious? Are you serious? We're in a pandemic and we're worried about germs, which we should be right now.
Right.
And I say this, like, for me, it was getting my kids ready for that protest. And I'm like, I can't believe I'm getting my kids ready, right, to go out in public in a pandemic, because the reality is racism is much more scarier for my family.
Yes.
And I have got to do something, right? I have got to be there for my community. And so that right there, I think, is what made it different, is that we were in a global pandemic and people could still not keep their hands off of Black and brown bodies. You know,
Yes.
even when we should have been the most kindest to one another, should have been last year. And we've seen the opposite. And so that has caused a lot of stress. There's been a lot of polarization for clients, a lot of separation. We have a lot of families that are transracial. And so we have a lot of clients that are coming in and they're like, my partner, they're saying my partner, they're saying my siblings that are a different race feel this way. What do I do? Do I not talk to my family? Some of my families don't even think COVID's a thing. Some people don't even think that, the police were wrong in these situations. How do I handle this, right? And so I think there's just so many combinations of so many stressors for Black and brown people, that's where we were saying we can't breathe. And so after when we heard George Floyd, that wasn't the first time we heard a Black man saying, I can't breathe. But us as a community, we could not breathe. It's too much. It's suffocating.
And this was going to play out now, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is going to be something generational that is going to play out. So Myra, I want to ask you, you've already kind of covered it a little bit about how it my question was going to be initially, when does it change from let's help to let's incarcerate? But it sounds like we're punishing even in kindergarten, right? There is a punitive spin on it. But when does it become, or maybe it always is, when does it become you're going to go and we're going to incarcerate you? And at what age does this change from medication to incarceration? And is it one worse, actually?
Well, I think it's so layered. And so I teach a class at Edgewood College, and it's a collaboration course. So as mental health professionals, I'll just give this, that's also a very layered question. I'm going to just answer it one way, but there's a lot of other answers I have.
I know you can with all of these. This is so complex. I'm sorry, but it's like, I want to allow you to cover a lot when you talk.
So I asked Gloria Reyes to come speak to the class, because right now, as mental health professionals, unfortunately, and we know there's a new model coming out in Dane County that I'm so excited about. It's similar to I don't know if they call it the CAHOOTS, but it's after the CAHOOTS model.
Yes.
So right now, I want to explain this to people. Whether it's your loved one, whether you're a mental health professional, there is no one to call when there's a crisis. The only person to call right now is police. And what the police do, whether you like the police or not, because there's a lot of mental health professionals, a lot of people I supervise, they're like, I absolutely will not ever call the police. I just don't, no. Like, we have it. And there are times where there are things where we're just like, we need someone. It's not the police, but we need somebody. But right now, the only person we have to call is the police. The police are trained to do one thing. They arrest.
Yeah.
They arrest, they ticket. They're not social workers. But right now in our society, we have it kind of in place where they kind of are supposed to be, right? So
Mhm.
there's a systemic disconnect, right, between that. They don't know how to de-escalate someone that maybe might have, might be in a manic episode of bipolar 1, right? They don't know how to do that. So if beds are full at Winnebago and the beds are full at the hospital, they put people in Dane County Jail,
Yes.
okay?
Yes.
So that's where they go. So there's a systemic issue. So right there, you see how we criminalize mental health, right? Because there is a straight line to do that. That's what you do. You call the police and the police do what they do, right?
Mhm.
And Gloria Reyes, when she talked to our class, it was really interesting. She talked about one situation she was in and about how she didn't want to arrest a mom one time. And her supervisor said, the beds are full. This is what you have to do. You have no choice. She said, but the person didn't do anything wrong. They're having a mental health breakdown. They're not doing anything wrong. They're being rowdy at a restaurant, but there was nothing really illegal, she felt, but she had to arrest the mom in front of the kids.
See, that's what I'm saying. Like, this conversation is so layered, right? And I knew this was going
Yeah,
to happen, that it's hard to even come up with action when we're still so far in the beginning of even understanding. Like,
right.
does the system understand? Do the schools understand? Do the teachers understand? And the answer is no, right?
Mhm.
And so it's hard to think of, like, I want to ask you, what do we do? But it sounds like we're so far in the beginning. Are we at action yet? No?
We have so many systems, right? I am excited about some practices that Dane County is putting in place right now. So I don't know how many people know, but they are doing that cahoots model.
Yeah.
And so I think they do have people hired. And what that will look like is there will be a peer support specialist, I believe.
Yes, that's what I've heard.
And then there will be, I don't know if there's going to be a social worker as well. And then like a EMT, right?
That's what I've heard.
And people can call them for mental health crisis. So they would still call the 911 dispatch and then ask for this team. And then this team would go out to the crisis instead of a police officer. So I think that's one huge systemic change. The other thing is Dane County is building kind of like a restorative center
Yes,
where
I've
then
heard.
people would be brought there, right? Is it restorative or restoration or something like that center?
Yes, and it's supposed to be based off the Red Hook one in
Yes.
New York. Yes.
These two things are a start. There needs to be
Mhm.
a lot of change, but it's a start as a mental health professional that I am so excited about. I am so excited. Once I can call somebody else other than the
Mhm.
police, it's going to be so much more trauma informed. I think also when clients see that uniform, and you're in a manic state or you're in psychosis or
Mhm.
something, it's just really scary having an officer come, right?
Totally. Yes.
And so I just think it's just going to be so helpful for a lot of people and a lot of families that have loved ones that have mental health issues.
So that's adult. Do you see things happening with you're doing something? Do you see the system, right? Like, I see Anesis going in and I've seen other groups going in. One, do you see the system doing things around restorative practices, trauma informed, having racial sensitive lens? So that was layered, but just answer about the system. And the other part is if not, what should be?
Yeah, I think the schools they have some good things, like in the high school level, they have that, like the YWCA Restorative Justice Program, which is really huge.
Yes.
I think there needs to be more, right? And I think you don't need to wait till high school. I think, kids can do that at a really young age. And so I think those practices just they need to kind of almost flip them. I mean, keep the high school, but start younger and then go older, right? Because kids,
Mhm.
once they get those practices too, they'll get used to doing that because they're like,
Yes.
oh, we've been doing this since we've been in kindergarten, right? Like, and
Right.
then it just gets a little bit more advanced for them. But I think starting at a younger age, I think the school could really focus on just doing even that would be really helpful. But I
Mhm.
think also there needs to be some kind of trainings or some kind of different system in the way they figure out how they're hiring teachers in certain communities as well.
Yeah, there's a study out there that if a white teacher is teaching a room full of um, multiracial children culturally, that the Black children will rate of success in getting into any advanced classes is like 30%. But if there is a teacher of color, everybody is successful in
Mhm.
the room. And so, yeah, so I think that that comes from us having undealt with biases that and not understanding it,
Yeah.
right? So how has Anesis ever thought about this question? How does someone go about getting trained in trauma informed? Is there anything, and has Anesis ever thought about it? Like, what if I want to go facilitate this? What if I want to get into the schools and be of assistance? I'm thinking specifically of like Moses's committee wanting to really dig in and be everything that they represent.
Yeah, I would say, well, one, so if you want to do like trauma groups, I really do think, people need to be like mental health professionals,
Mm-hmm,
right? Or it be paired with a mental health professional. So like,
mm-hmm,
peer support and a mental health professional or,
mm-hmm,
something like that.
mm-hmm.
But I do think everyone should be trauma informed. And so I think like wherever you work at, like asking for that type of training and, like your employer, or if you are the employer, like finding that person that can do, or a company that can do that trauma informed care. But then also it needs to be, that discussion of race needs to be added with that trauma informed care. I think that's huge. So it needs to
Yes.
be kind of like a training that is blended and like really fully scope, like has that full scope.
I have said often I'm a trainer for a certified peer specialist, and I really feel like the whole world needs to take the training. We'd live in a much better place if people understood everybody's and a very person-centered that the people we are working with us are the experts in their lives, and we need to listen to them. Um, so I'm a teacher and I work at the high school level. How do I recognize and stop this last stop? How do I recognize and maybe prevent a child from going to prison? What can I do? Is there anything actionable you can think of?
I think, one, being a supportive teacher to all your students,
Mm,
to all of them,
mhm,
seeing, the strengths in all the students,
mhm,
not looking at things from like a deficit, right? I think also figuring out, doing your own training on like, I really like the justified anger training that Pastor G is doing for allies.
mhm,
I think understanding history, understanding just kind of like your own racial development. And so there's like, I know when white people figure out kind of like trauma, or not trauma, but like racism is real, that there is
mhm,
a development that white people go through.
mm.
So it's denial at first that it exists. Then there's the white guilt, right? And then there's like, so there's a development in that. And I think, if you are a white person, you kind of have to go through that development, right? So whatever, and you're not going to get it in your regular education, unfortunately. So you have to go out and seek that. Um, and then I really like the Harvard racial bias test.
Yes.
So I always encourage people to take that. Again, you can Google it, it's free. I always say everyone has a bias. Don't say that you don't see color. Research tells us again by age 4, you've seen it and you know about it. And so we all have it. And if you knew about it, it wouldn't be called implicit bias.
Mhm.
And so you have to take the test to really kind of understand, right? But just assume and know that you have it and that we all have it because we're products of the United States and living here in this society that is very, very racial. It's everything's about race, whether we like it or not.
So before I go into questions, that was a really fast like hour. See, I know I needed 2 hours with you. Um, I'll get you later. If you were to say trauma, we can make this impact in schools around trauma, it would be top 3 things.
Okay, say that again. The top 3 things.
Top 3 things that we could do that would drastically change how we address and work with trauma in the schools. What would they be?
Mm.
The outcome for children.
Having school therapists,
Mm.
teachers doing kind of their own like training. I don't know if like this is just an idea. Could all the MMSD teachers go through Alex G's training? Maybe he has one, just maybe MMSD pays for
They got a budget.
to do that just for only them, right? Like a closed off training. Third thing, also trauma informed training for all teachers and staff.
Love it. I love talking to you. We do have some questions. I just want to remind everybody before I take questions that this is normally a fundraiser with all of us in the same room having lunch, which we will do next year, and hopefully I'll be there being the MC. But remember, so if you can afford to give anything today, the link is in. Did someone post the link? Yes, there, see, Anne is on it. You can donate there. So I know we have some questions in here. Let me see. There was quite a few. I'm going to post in the chat the ACE when Myra starts answering this next question. Is there ever really recovery from trauma? I know someone who has been seeing a therapist for most of their life and really seems to still have a lot of trauma from childhood abuse. Any ideas that might help at that point in one's life? Thank you so much for the good work and information.
Yeah, it's different for everyone. It's different. And sometimes it's based on, sometimes it doesn't matter what age you get the treatment. I would say for people that have really complex trauma and come in later, and if like the trauma was done, the childhood trauma was by caregivers, it is going to take longer. It is a little bit more damaging, but yes, people can heal from trauma. What I always say is there's a lot of brain development that they've done in studies on like even the blood flow and how your blood flows to your brain. And so what they find is that when you've had a lot of trauma and you have PTSD, it's more around your brainstem. And that's where we talk about that fight, flight, freeze. And then I also say fawn, right? And so that's that brain stem, that instinctual kind of part of your brain, which makes sense if you're in trauma a lot, right? That you need that part of your brain. But your frontal lobe is where you make really wise decisions. You make, kind of like the logical things, like this isn't safe. This is like you can slow down and make a decision. After you've done a lot of trauma therapy, right? With kids that they've done these studies, that then the blood flow was starting to flow back again, more in an even part of the brain, where then that frontal lobe was getting the same amount as the brainstem was. So again, you can see why kids and why adults may act a certain way that have trauma that's untreated, right?
Yes.
Because they're working off that fight, flight, or freeze, fawn part of the brain.
And isn't that kind of a misconception in itself too, that we have to ever stop talking or going to therapy? I mean, I think it'd be great if everybody could go to it for the rest of their lives. There's always something.
There is always something, unfortunately. Life always is something.
Okay. How do people needing to call for help learn about their options and know to ask for the Cahoots team? I don't know if you know the answer to that or not, but
Yeah, they're not up and running yet. I believe the last time I talked to Carrie from the county, I think they're trying to pilot it right now. And when it does open and start, it's only going to be downtown first. So
okay.
it's not going to be even when they do start it, it's not going to be accessible to the whole Dane County quite yet. It will be just downtown Madison.
I was very happy to hear that they were going to have a multidisciplinary team. I'm such a believer in multidisciplinary work because that's when the people who we're working with voice really finally gets heard, right? Is when, because we all have perceptions of how it's supposed to be done from the lens we were educated in. Let's see. When children are expelled from daycare, how do you begin to help?
Yeah, so sometimes that's when we get a lot of referrals. If there's been like a lot of, if the kid has been expelled more than once, sometimes we'll get referrals that way. So that's, I mean, that's where we come in because we're not in the preschool, you know. So that's where we would step in, is if we got a referral or if a parent called and just wanting some support.
Okay. Let me see. Do we have anything else? Is there anything else that I'm missing? Anybody else in the room?
It looks like a hand up, Judy Lyons, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yes, I can't see that. Sorry, I don't have mine on that view. I can change it
I
now.
put in a question about the first of two intervention programs that you mentioned, Myra. The second of which was restorative justice. I did not catch the first one. Can you give us that again? And does that make sense?
Oh, what
The
part
one
of-
I think you are doing, the CBITS?
Oh, the CBITS.
CBITS.
All right, say, and tell me again what that stands for, please.
Cognitive behavioral intervention in schools.
Thank you.
I love that you guys are starting to get into the schools. It's so important with that piece, right, of which was the reason we had this, is that idea that, you know, I've heard like Rudy Banks talk about it when he did his PBS, that pipeline that we know exists, but how do we interrupt it? And I think it's trauma, dealing with the trauma, and then educating the system, and having someone like Anesis doing something like this in there, both could happen, right?
Right.
All right. Let's see. Anyone else? Otherwise, I have more questions and I'll just keep talking. If our system doesn't, and I don't like talking about negative a lot, because I really believe that with all of the people in this room showing up for this today, all the people that register for this, what Anesis does, what the people I work with do, what Justine does, all of that, that we do want to see it. But if we don't get systemic change, what do we look like in 10 years? What does trauma look like if it goes unaddressed?
Well, I think it's a two-part question, because right now, again, giving that example of the referrals to CPS even, right? So 10 years from now, if we don't do any change, right now we're setting up for Black and brown families to be incarcerated, for families to be separated. And we're going to see a whole lot more of that if things don't change. And if people are not, you know, getting the trauma therapy, right, we're going to see that manifest in a lot of different things as well, because we've experienced trauma. Everyone has experienced some type of trauma, even just the past year, right? Now, again, that might not felt like trauma to everyone, right? But for some people, it was really, really hard, right, this past year. And so if we don't get help and people don't get services, it's going to look very different for people, right? It's going to be a lot of substance abuse, increase in substance abuse, increase in domestic violence, increase in, you know, abuse of children. Because again, if you're not getting treatment, you're going to cope in other ways. And usually people cope in unhealthy ways, right? Because again, that blood is flowing in that certain part of your brainstem. So that's what happens, is usually a lot of unhealthy things when trauma is not treated.
I had just finished and need to reread Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And you're reminding me of that as you keep talking about everyone suffering from trauma, right? Like, because after reading that book, I learned and didn't even think about the trauma that white people have went with unaddressed historically, of even participating, being a part of, and some 100 years ago, watching and allowing their children to watch, right? And how that changed DNA.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little, I know you know
Yeah,
about it. I don't need to ask you that.
I've read it, yes.
Yeah.
And I do think, again, and I think it comes to play now, like when we're looking at the numbers of like CPS referrals. And I was just shocked. I was just like, what about all the other kids that are getting like really maltreated in their homes that are white? Why are
Yeah.
teachers not seeing that?
Mhm.
You know, and I think there's just, I don't know, maybe teachers just try to reach out and support the families in different ways. You
Yeah.
know, it makes you wonder, like, what is that? Is it from our past? Is it a certain narrative that teachers are telling themselves on? I don't know. It might be tied to that, what you were just saying.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
very interesting.
Absolutely. So there's a question. CPS is mentioned, but what about the youth justice system? Are there any trauma-informed initiatives being done in that area? I know that they closed one, right? We're figuring out scared straight and incarceration, and that
Yeah.
goes wrong a lot of times. Do you know
Yeah.
any of that are like in the courts or anything?
I will say, we have Lincoln Hill still open.
Mm-hmm.
That's an issue.
Yeah,
That place needs to be closed.
closed. I
That
agree.
place has done so much trauma to kids. So there's a lot that needs to happen within that system. I have so much respect for John Bauman, in that juvenile part, and the trauma informed, as much as they can do within a broken system. They have done a lot of work, their department, for the juvenile detention in the shelter home. They've done so much trauma informed training, and you know, if you look at other detention centers around the country, what they've done has just been like they watch Netflix with the kids. They have that place painted. The kids have painted it. I mean, you just don't
Mhm.
see places like that. And again, it's a broken system, but I think they're doing the best within that system that they can. So I know there are people that are really, really trying to be as trauma informed as they can in the place that they're at.
I have also, and it's one of those ones, right? Because they're under 18. We
Yeah.
don't hear about everything that went wrong in that system until they're over 18. It's the transparency isn't there under the guise of, right, protection. And
Right.
James has his hand up. James?
Oh, yes. Just a quick comment. System is not broken. It's designed to do what it is doing.
Agree.
A quick example, many people here today know that I am state certified peer specialist, have worked in the schools with young children. I'm aware of the historical traumas and very well aware of the fact that they are paying close attention to issues around race. One of the first questions they tend to ask us when we are there is about race. Why do they hate us? How do we begin? And I'm not expecting an answer to this, because I also believe that one of the ways that we are going to begin to really find solutions is to pay closer attention to the language that we use when we're establishing these processes. Is that language more inclusive? Is it a continuation of excluding people? So I think we have to be careful with that. But do you think it would be wise, particularly for Dane County, to look at some of the restrictions that they have against people who have experienced incarceration to have access to help to interrupt the school to prison pipeline, to have access to young adults, to actually walk with them and guide them through some of these processes. Do you think that would be a productive idea, so to speak?
I love that idea. I think that would be so great. I think that is what the school is missing. You know, if you go into smaller white communities where schools are, they're so community focused. They're so like in their community, and it's just like I don't know how to explain it. I don't feel that from MMSD. And I think that that is something that could be so powerful if more community members, right, especially people that have had certain experiences, right, around incarceration or things like that, could go into the schools and do different things like that. I think that would be right. I think it would be phenomenal. I love it.
I love it too, James. That was a great idea.
Mm.
So I want to do something, but I'm just the person that goes to work. I have a 9 to 5. I might work in a bank or as a farmer, and I have no idea what to do. What can I do? What is the average person can do,
Mm.
either within the school system, in the community? I know I could tell them things, but as far as with like even Anesis or in the schools, what could they do, Myra?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, and I know this might not seem like glamorous or like a lot,
Mhm.
but I think is just educating your own self and going through your own process and doing that either like with your family. And then even if you don't go in and do anything, because I think also sometimes we hear this saying like that white saviorism, like being a savior, like the us, like trying to save people, right? And I think sometimes like that's not what we need always. It's just like for me, when I go into like a more of like a white community, it's small things sometimes. It's like the little Black Lives That Matter sign or something, or just something that makes me feel like, okay, this person must have done some education and
Mhm.
I think I'm safe here, right? Like sometimes it's just being a safe person within a community, or an educated person that can then talk to other people and other friends and relatives and educating them. I think that is what our nation needs so much right now.
So much.
And I feel like as like, a Black woman, sometimes we're always asked to be also the educator of those things. And I really love it when white people are like super educated and they're like, no. And they're like, they're in their community and they're like telling other people like, this is what our history is. This is the work I've done. This is what I know. I think that's what we need. And it might not seem glamorous because
No,
we're
I
helping,
100%.
but it's huge.
I 100% agree. And because I think there's this misconception, like every Black person is educated about racism and historical, like I had to go educate myself about about
Mhm.
slavery. Why shouldn't anybody else that's going to show up in the space? And I agree. I love it. I have
Yeah.
lots of people I work with that are sometimes more educated than me and can say some statistics. And I'm like, you go, girl. And I
Yeah.
just get to relax and let them do it. And the truth is, if we all want to be true, is sometimes I can talk till I'm blue in the face, and this is true, and it shouldn't have to be, but it is. But until that white voice standing next to me says, yeah, what she said, nobody heard anything in the room.
Yeah. I've experienced that as well.
And so educating yourself so that you can be the supportive person in the lives of us as we do the work, I think is very important. And I think it is, it doesn't sound glamorous, but it sure is what's going to make a difference.
It makes a huge difference.
This has been so awesome. So one more time, reminder, here's the PayPal link. Anybody that can, these talks are really important to Moses, and educating people and allowing people to be able to show up for free for those that can't afford. But it is important for those that can to be able to donate and make sure that the stuff like this can keep happening for Moses, and that Moses can keep doing the work. I thank you very much, Myra. I will talk to you again very soon. And I will turn it over to, who am I turning it over to? Is it Ann or
Me.
Rachel? Hi, Rachel. Thank you
Hi.
so much. All right.
Well, I wanted to thank our honored guest, Myra, for all the information she imparted to us that day. Yeah, we can clap. And Carmela for being our conversationalist MC. Yeah. And thank you all for coming, and I hope you really had a enjoyable afternoon with us. So until next year, thank you.